A reading from the book of Job. Job answered God, "I'm convinced you can do anything and everything. Nothing and no one can upset your plans. You asked, 'Who is this muddying the water, ignorantly confusing the issue, second-guessing my purposes?' I admit it, I was the one. I babbled on about things far beyond me, made small talk about wonders way over my head. You told me, 'Listen, and let me do the talking. Let me ask the questions. You give the answers.' I admit I once lived by rumors of you. Now I have it all firsthand, from my own eyes and ears. I'm sorry, forgive me. I'll never do that again, I promise. I'll never again live on crusts of hearsay and crumbs of rumor." All his brothers and sisters and friends came to his house and celebrated. They told him how sorry they were and consoled him for all the trouble God had brought him. Each of them brought generous housewarming gifts. God blessed Job's later life even more than his earlier life. He ended up with 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 teams of oxen, and 1,000 donkeys. He also had 7 sons and 3 daughters. He named the first daughter Dove, the second Cinnamon, and the third Dark Eyes. There was not a woman in that country as beautiful as Job's daughters. Their father treated them as equals with their brothers, providing them the same inheritance. Job lived on another 140 years, living to see his children and grandchildren, 4 generations of them. Then he died, an old man, a full life.
Colonial has more than its share of ministers, people who've been to seminary, people who have pastored churches or been chaplains and all kinds of things. We had 2 or 3 in our early service, and we do the same in this service as well. This is one of the really fascinating books of the Bible, and my guess would be that there are many ministers who won't touch it. Sort of like the progressives have a hard time touching what? The last book of the Bible? We have a hard time with some scriptures. I've provided these playbills as an opportunity to maybe to tease you into thinking more about the rhythms of the story, or to give you something to think about in the week. On the back page for deeper thought, following the divine speeches, these are the divine speeches of God. God speaks, that's the way I think about it. Job has a change of heart and mind, and he comes to recognize that how the world works is beyond human comprehension or imagination. In other words, there is mystery, chaos, and unpredictability in the world in which we live. We are participants in a free, dynamic creation. I mentioned that this is my attempt to speak up about maybe what I believe is probably the misdirection related to some kind of God's will talk, where everything is encountered, good or bad, comes across as some act that the divine has exercised. The Bible, though, tells us Job was an ancient man who walked faithfully with God. Very clear from the outcome. This is the beginning of a life, and this is a stalwart man. A sign of this kind of life is witnessed when everything you see about the goodness of life, defined in Hebrew culture as a wife and having grown sons particularly, Grown daughters are okay too, but the grown sons are a sign of blessedness. And all the bounty of sheep and camels, that inventory that was given at the very beginning and also at the end, is a way of the Bible's language of pointing to someone and say, God has surely blessed this person, this man. And then in a sudden flurry of loss, one wave of crazy sadness after another, all of this is taken away. And only then did Job discover that he had been in a social experiment between God and Satan. And then he was left to wonder what it all meant. After Job's fall from an exemplary life, he was the epitome of what a blessed person is like. His tragic loss of children, the devastation and the loss of all the signs of his vast wealth. He was just amazing. And we come to this too perfect ending. Perhaps you thought something like this. So Job gets a replacement family, new flocks and all, and that's supposed to take the place of the tragic obliteration of the first ones? That's the question that I think when we read the book of Job, we cannot help but be drawn toward that kind of questioning. The problem with the ending of Job is that it sounds too much like a quick fix, like a 30-minute Hollywood TV show that uncovers the problem, struggles with it, and then comes to some sweet conclusion by the end. It's as if the end of Job is altogether too neat. It's all tucked in. It's disconnected from real life, perhaps. And so maybe it struggles with truthfulness, and we struggle with it in this. And from Job's final testimony, we realize he too has come to some conclusion, some acceptance about everything that has happened. But is that truthful itself? In this fourth act of Job, Job submits to a theological tour de force, because God is simply too powerful and too wise for any mortal to challenge. Job realizes he cannot contest God's justice. He can't get up into God's face and make his argument for very long. He realizes God's ways are beyond his. He feels meek and mortal at this point, up against the divine who is all-powerful. And so the only dialogue he's been capable of maintaining with God has essentially been one way. Job comes to accept he must stop speaking, and he must listen. That whole idea of stopping speaking and opening up our ears and listening, that's a really fascinating move. I think about, in preparation for ministry, the journey of self that most ministers go through called CPE, Clinical Pastoral Education. Some of you have been through it. In CPE, we run through the grindstone of pastoral anxiety, and the anxiety is as much inside of us as it is around the circumstances of why we're there. The object of study has been called the living human document. That's a strange name to give real-life human beings who show up at the hospital or maybe in the pastor's office even. In the hospital, chaplains have no idea of what's about to walk in the door. A very powerful reminder that you have no idea of what's coming next. And when the doors fling open and the ambulance drivers come in and they carry on a cart somebody who's had an accident or is deathly sick, you know that the damage is not just to the physical being, because right behind them typically come the family, members of the family. They show up. Maybe the neighbors show up. Maybe the church members themselves show up next. And before you know it, in the right circumstances, the ER room can be full of people who are concerned about the patient who just came in. And the chaplain, it's the chaplain's job to navigate all the currents, all the things that are happening, the emotional friction that might also come with the patient. You never know what will come with all that. On your first night as a chaplain in CPE, almost predictably in the middle of the night, someone comes in who is in a tragic condition on a gurney, and they're brought in. Maybe it's a grandmother who's fallen deathly ill, and she comes in on a cart, and sure enough, she is ill. There's nothing to be done. The doctors do what they can do at the very beginning, and there's nothing to be done because grandma has just died. And then her family shows up. And the doctor says to you as your first night chaplain, I want you to be in the room when we talk about this. And that's when you go, oh my goodness, what am I doing here? The doctor is looking for the chaplain to be able to attend to the family. The dead are done with the cares of life. That's the way it is. That's how it happens. The long struggle of life and maybe illness, all of that is over. There's no hope of rescue. There are no magic things that can happen in the ER to bring this one back to life. They have died. There's a sense of hopelessness that settles in. The staff feel that, the nurses, the doctor comes to the end of what steps that they can take, and they are ready for the next stage to happen. And then there's the overwhelming sense of having nothing to say. That's what the chaplain is pondering in that moment. Oh my goodness, what will I say in that moment? It's a terrible sense of emptiness. And so the next day in sessions with the supervisor, the young chaplain goes over these circumstances with the supervisor. And finally, the supervisor has heard all of this and says, here's the deal. You can't do anything to fix the problem. That woman is still dead. And there's not one thing that you can say that's going to bring her back. Your job then is to turn toward the people that are there, the family, the sons or daughters, the grandchildren, the friends. Your job is to make sure these people know that they're not there alone. That's what the supervisor says. It makes all the sense in the world outside of that setting to understand that. But when you're in the moment, it's very, very difficult, and chaplains have such a hard time dealing with these things. When someone passes through what I call a Jobian season, a season like Job, whether it's yours or whether it's someone that you love and care for, there are no simple fixes, no miracles that can be brought in that happen to take you out of that season. There's no advice worth giving, no fixing one another, no setting one another straight. Those are lines that come from Parker Palmer, called the Parker Palmer Rules. There's not really anything that you have to say that will take this problem and move it out. The only thing that we can offer is kindness and love. In the communal life of a church, sometimes we gather and the best we do is hug one another. We come in memory and respect of someone that we've lost. Maybe the best thing that we can do is to take care of one another. There are occasions when a church member has lost a loved one, or they're present when their dear family member takes their last breath. These are circumstances in pastoral ministry where the minister does not have the words that are adequate for the moment of pain. Moments like that must be endured, though. because when it comes to life and death, there's no quick fix. The complexities of life and death are truly challenging for us. Sorrow and pain. When you go through sorrow and you go through pain, there's hardly anything to hold up next to that because you're going through it. Contrition, reconciliation perhaps, these are ever-present possibilities, and the caring church must allow some wiggle room for these feelings to be explored and for this person to feel supported in the way that they do. Do you realize that we have lost 7 million people, over 7 million, to COVID in the last, 3 years or so? Many others are still suffering from it. And that's just one example of something worldwide that is a part of the way the world is brought together. And some of them are living in the life of Job, half healed, half well, but still struggling. And how many of those are caught in the endless questions that surface and we just don't seem to have an answer? There is in Job this unexpected ending. The Lord blessed the latter days of Job more than his beginning. That is a complicated idea. I'm not sure I quite fully understand it. From beginning to the end, Job lost everything: his livestock, his home, his children, all wiped out. His entire fortune disappeared, and then it struck him. It struck him bodily. And it's fairly graphic in the Bible about how he suffered. But then the turnaround happens, and God restored his herds and doubled their numbers. He lost 7 sons and 3 daughters in chapter 1, and by the end of the story, he has 7 new sons and 3 new daughters. We have a phrase in our language that we use every now and then, as fate would have it. We use that occasionally as a sort of a transitional device, a robust way of observing that sometimes we twist and turn on the events that occur in our lives, recognizing that sometimes there are good events and sometimes there are tragic events. And on occasion, maybe more than we actually know, even the tragic events can sometimes have the tendency, given some time and some reflection, to actually act positively in our regard. That's a really hard thing to piece together, particularly at the time. Sometimes that takes looking over your shoulder into the backdrop to see how that thing, which actually was not very good, turned out to be actually very good for you. In her book, God's Medicine, Barbara Brown Taylor tells us that providence is not about God's will overriding our own. It is more like a dance, a mysterious dance that takes place between God's freedom and our freedom, between God's will and our own will. In this dance, it's not God's job to keep bad things from happening. They do happen. This is just truthful about life. They happen. I don't know how, I don't know why, but I have run into some of those, and so have you. Are fate and whimsy merely the shallow end of the swimming pool? Are we subjected to these things without having a clue about what they're about? God's job is not to prevent bad things from happening to us. God simply does not do that, or to make good things happen. God's job is to stay present in our lives, creating whole worlds out of total chaos, breathing life into piles of dust. When you think about that, when you reflect upon that, you begin to see the cycle of life operating. The leaves are a part of that. The leaves that are a sign of just death that's happening. Did the tree die? No. We don't know that at the time. But come spring, we'll get our answer. All of us want a happy ending to the problems we face. But in life, our happy moments are mixed in with our share of occasions when we suffer. This is what happens. We get a little of both, don't we? Life is a mixture of these kinds of moments. Some are accidents. They're purely accidents. I don't know why that happened or how it happened, but it did happen. The accident occurs. And some of them are self-inflicted. If I look deep enough at something and discover there was some string that I pulled that tipped over this issue that became bad for me, that's another thing. I think about those, don't you? Maybe Job is a highly dramatic story meant to illustrate that none of us live perfect lives, supremely happy in the most affluent ways, but that we all live in this mix of good and bad, of wonderful things that are way beyond our ability to conjure up. They're so good. And things that are so horrible that we don't quite know what to do. Too much of one or the other, and we don't know what we would do with it. In the end, at the end of this wonderful, reflective book of the Bible, Job's wealth increased, and he lived 140 extra years. Job saw 4 generations of descendants. And then the Bible says Job died, old and full of days. Boom, the end. Roll the credits.